And the question is, and if you notice you can answer this. So whether you've already returned to your workplace or soon to return to your workplace, how do you feel about it? So do you feel safe? Do you feel somewhat safe? Or do you feel unsafe? And I'll give you about 20 seconds to put your responses in, and then I'll share those results with you. Everybody did the poll? All right. I'm gonna share the results. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Stop sharing. Did I launch it? Maybe I didn't launch it. Okay. Share results. Okay. The poll was not, did everyone do the poll? It didn't launch? You didn't see it? Well, I can't, forget it. Forget it. We'll just go forward. All right, because we have a lot of questions, so sorry about that. All right, so without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce the first panelist, and each panelist I'm going to introduce, and then give them an opportunity to talk with you briefly, and then we'll have a full panel discussion. All right, so our first panelist is Bob Fetter. So Bob's practice focuses on representing employees and unions in disputes against employers. He litigates cases in the state and federal courts. He also litigates unfair labor practices before the National Labor Relations Board and the Michigan Employment Relations Commission. He's also represented clients with claims before other governmental agencies, including the EEO, the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the Michigan Civil Rights Commission, the Michigan Department of Labor and Economic Growth, and the United States Department of Labor. He also has successfully arbitrated many cases. I'm proud to say that Bob is a graduate with a law degree and an MBA with a focus on industrial relations from Wayne State University, and he's also one of our part-time faculty in our labor center. So Bob. Bob?
There we go. Thank you, Gail. Welcome, everybody. Yeah, these issues with COVID have presented a lot of interesting legal issues, obviously some interesting practical issues, but as an attorney, I tend to focus on legal issues. Lots of new legislation, a lot of trying to figure out how to apply old legislation to a pandemic. And it's been an ever-changing environment with new executive orders, new guidance from various government agencies coming out on a nearly daily basis. But one thing I want to touch on in some level of detail in the few minutes that I have is the paid leave under the Families First Act, because that applies to a lot of people in the situations that we have. So that is really broken into two parts. The first part is the emergency paid sick leave, which provides 2 weeks or 10 days of paid leave under various circumstances. You get 100% pay for 3 circumstances, which is if you're quarantined due to a protective state or federal order. 2 is if you're advised by a healthcare worker that you must stay quarantined. Or 3, if you have symptoms of COVID-19 and are seeking medical attention. In those 3 scenarios, the worker gets 2 weeks, 10 days of 100% pay. You get 2/3 pay if you're caring for any individual that is quarantined or that is seeking medical attention for COVID, or if the employee is caring for a child whose school or child care provider is unavailable due to COVID-19, which up until the schools let out for the summer applied to just about anybody who had a child of school age. It would still apply for those who have child care issues. Normally you have a daycare or a summer camp that the child would normally go to during the summer, which is closed. It would still apply. Some question as to whether grandma applies. Grandma's not available because she shouldn't be around the kids. I would argue that that would be applicable as well. The other part of it is an expansion of FMLA. On the expansion of FMLA, it allows for the child care obligations to extend that 2/3 pay for an additional 10 weeks. So for the full 12-week period, up to $200 a week, or I'm sorry, $200 a day for child care. Now, for the emergency paid sick leave, it has no requirement that you work there for any length of time. And unlike normal FMLA, there's no requirement that you would work there or you have to be there for 30 days. So these would also apply to newer employees. There are some exceptions and a few other small issues. In the few minutes I just wanted to make sure that that's there. That all of these apply to employers of less than 500 employees, which is the vast majority of American workers. But it does not apply to those larger employers that are over 500. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Gail. She has to unmute herself.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, Bob. All right. So at this time, then I also like to introduce Richard Mack. As an attorney, Richard has secured millions of dollars in judgments for his union and individual clients. His noteworthy victories include more than $1 million for the 36th District Court, that's in Detroit, employees who were illegally furloughed. He's also obtained back pay awards for hundreds of City of Detroit employees that were illegally laid off. Also, he received awards for retirees that are on fixed incomes who face illegal reductions in their compensation and their health care. He's been named super lawyer in Michigan for 3 consecutive years from 2011 through 13. He serves on the Labor and Employment, the board of the Labor Employment section of the State Bar of Michigan. He teaches also at Wayne State University and our labor studies program, and he has received his JD from Wayne State University's law school. He's also a partner. He and Bob are both partners at Miller Cohen. So Richard.
Thank you, Gail. You just reminded me, I've got to update that website. So the time that we're in, ladies and gentlemen, is a very, very unique time. I don't think any of us have seen anything like this, not just with respect to the pandemic and the health issues that we're facing, of course, the police issues that we're facing, but the legal issues that apply to all of you in your workplace. I mean, literally, if you look on the state website for executive orders, we're up to 124 executive orders that Governor Whitmer has put out since March. You literally have to look at them every day to see what new law applies. And these executive orders apply across the state as governing law. So it's a state of flux, and it's great that you all are in tuned and engaged to want to learn. But honestly, some of the stuff that we tell you today may change soon. So you just have to continue to remain engaged. My task was to go briefly over the unemployment laws. And as Gail said earlier, unemployment does, there's a federal component to the unemployment, but it largely is determined by state law. So really, if you're in a state different than Michigan, you obviously have to check your state laws. But if you remember nothing else about the overview, the point of the unemployment law from the federal government, from its perspective, is to give an additional $600 per week to individuals for up to 39 weeks or up to July 31st of this year. There are 3 different types of categories of unemployment that you can get. The first is if you are eligible for state unemployment, you apply at your state, then you will also get the $600. So that's just like normal procedure. You've called or you go online rather and try to seek unemployment, and then you'll have the additional federal component. The other part to it is that if you are no longer eligible for state unemployment, the federal government saw fit to also grant those individuals with unemployment benefits, where you would get the same amount that the state would have given you, plus the federal component. And that there's 3 different components. That's the second component. That's a bridge, which really goes for 13 weeks. And then the final component is if you're not eligible for the first component or the second component, that if you are off work for some reason related to COVID, essentially, there's a long list of 19 specific reasons, then you can apply and you can still get the state and the federal unemployment. So again, the bottom line is, if you remember nothing else, apply. If, I had an individual call me who said, I just got out of prison, a few months ago, I'm not eligible for state unemployment. And I told him apply, because not only is there the first component, but there are the other 2. And he ended up receiving the unemployment. A couple of important pieces to this. It does apply to, thankfully, independent contractors. It captures the gig economy. So typically unemployment is for employees. It applies for employees who just began to work. As a matter of fact, the most recent executive order on unemployment specifies that the charge account for the employer is not charged necessarily. So therefore, if you just started work, normally you have to work a certain number of weeks before you can apply for unemployment at the new employer. That's not here. So it's basically taken by the state instead of the individual charge accounts. So for those of you get into the weeds of unemployment, every employer is taxed a certain amount and they get a certain amount of money put in their bucket called the charge account. And when people apply for unemployment, that's taken out. Well, now the state's covering it. Another important piece to this is that if you are eligible with respect to the main component, if you're eligible for state, even if you are not eligible for the full amount of unemployment, if you just are eligible for $1, just $1 of unemployment in the state component, you can still get the full $600. So what does that mean? That means that if you are working a normal 40-hour work week and your hours get cut to 20 hours or 10 hours or 5 hours, again, if you're eligible, but if you're still working, your hours get cut to 32 hours. If you're still working and you're only eligible for partial unemployment, you still get this additional $600. So for instance, you saw recently in the city of Detroit, the plan anyway, was that the mayor announced he would lay off partially or furlough certain employees, and they would get less unemployment. They would still work part-time, get less unemployment, but still get the $600. And so that's why you do see instances where people would make more money while off doing part work than working the full time. Couple other quick points, and then we'll go back. If you are on a leave, a paid leave, you are not eligible for unemployment. So you can get unemployment if you are off on a medical leave, if you're off due to some COVID-related reason, essentially. And Michigan has several reasons as to why you can get unemployment. But if you're being paid, if you're drawing down on your sick bank, for instance, unemployment excludes you. The goal, of course, is that you're not supposed to get unemployment and the your paid leave from your employer. So that's an important point you want to keep in mind.
Okay.
And so the other, finally, I'll just leave you with the fact that normally unemployment, when you apply, at least in Michigan, you're supposed to apply for the week prior to your last day of work. I'm sorry, the week after your last week of work. So like if you stop working on a Friday, you should apply by the next Friday. Well, now, given all of the problems with unemployment, they've extended that, again, in the most recent order, which I believe is Executive Order 76, for those of you who are interested. They've extended that to 28 days, given the fact that there's been so many people applying and it's been difficult for many people to get payment. So again, if you remember nothing else, the goal is apply, tell people to apply. There's a good chance they'll get something.
Okay. Thank you, Richard. Thank you. All right. And then our last panelist is Sean Egan. Sean has recently been named by the state of Michigan as Director of COVID-19 Workplace Safety. He's also responsible for ensuring that businesses across the state begin to reopen under the Michigan Safe Start Plan. They they can enact strict safety measures to protect the health and safety of their employees and customers. In addition to that role, so he has two jobs, he also serves as Deputy Director for labor at the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity, where he brings a wealth of knowledge as he oversees MIOSHA, Workers' Disability Compensation, the Bureau of Labor Relations, and the Wage and Hour Division for the state of Michigan. Sean is also a Navy veteran, an activist, a journeyman electrician, and a proud member of IBEW. That's the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, and has been for the past 23 years. In IBEW, he had several positions that he held, such as business manager, president, shop steward, labor council president, building trades president, general counsel, and more. Sean has spent his entire employment career advocating for working people. Now, Sean's a little different. He earned his JD from Thomas Cooley Law School. And he did that by going to school on weekends and after work at night. So, Sean.
Well, thank you, Gail. I appreciate that introduction. I think, like Richard, I'm going to have to shrink that down. You start to blush after a few seconds. So, hi, everybody. This will tell you how COVID is. We're all indoors on a Zoom meeting in the middle of June on a beautiful day. So I appreciate you taking the time to be with us and kind of hear what we have to say so that we can give you the tools that you need to be successful out there. So some of when the poll wasn't going, many people put in the comments what was happening in their workplace, and out of those, it was safe, somewhat safe, and just a couple of unsafes, which is exactly what we would hope for. In my role as the COVID-19 Workplace Safety Director, I'm going to be expanding on the things that we were doing, as Gail mentioned, with MIOSHA. Is still going to be the primary vehicle for workplace safety. And I am very proud to tell you that from the beginning of this crisis, before the Stay Home, Stay Safe order, MIOSHA was among the first in the nation to start using the General Duty Clause to enforce the CDC guidelines in the workplace. And we've continued to do that throughout this crisis. When everybody kind of went home, we modified our investigation processes to allow for some remote investigations to really help hammer through these issues, because like every employer, the state of Michigan as an employer has an obligation to keep those workers safe too. And we've done pretty well. We know we've had some challenges in higher risk and very high risk workplaces, but overall, things are looking okay. Now, like all of you, as we're returning to work more fully, keep in mind that probably 60%, maybe even a little higher, of Michigan workers were continuing to work through the Stay Home, Stay Safe order as essential or critical infrastructure workers. So those numbers were still very large, and there was a lot of things that those employers had to do very quickly to comply with those CDC guidelines. Since that time, working with MIOSHA and the governor, we've had an executive order. I don't remember what number it started as, but now it's 114 that puts together some very specific workplace safety practices that every employer needs to comply with. And again, at MIOSHA, we will use the general duty clause to enforce those requirements, as well as the CDC guidelines. So I shared in the chat box, and for those of you that aren't in there, we have a specific website. It's michigan.gov/COVID workplace safety, where we've posted created specifically by MIOSHA guidelines for every workplace that's been listed by the governor, as well as general industry guidelines. So if you work somewhere where you don't see an industry listed for you or your type of employer, go to that general industry, because that flows through every employer. And it's going to include those things that you're getting really familiar with, which are health screenings. Those are critical, because when we look from a safety perspective, keeping that out of the workplace is the most valuable tool we have. So that's the reason for those health screenings. And then engineering and access controls like physical barriers, staggering shifts, closing break rooms, all of that kind of stuff. And why are we doing all that? And it's quite simple. While science and the news keeps kind of changing on what's happening with COVID, and we're all listening to all this information, there's a few things that have stayed static throughout. We know that it's primarily transmitted through aerosols. So every time we talk, and thank goodness we're on Zoom, we are ejecting particulates from our mouths and our noses that are going out into the air. Most of those will be larger, and gravity will take them down in the first couple of meters, as the scientists say, which is 6 feet. Some of those will get aerosolized, and they can remain in the air for some time. So where you're seeing that social distancing, is to give the gravity time to take care of those droplets, and face covering is to try to protect you from expelling those things. That's one of the things that I try to highlight all the time when we talk about PPE. Personal protective equipment is intended to protect the employee. These cloth face coverings we're doing are not protecting you, they're protecting others from you. So that's why it's critical that not only do I wear one to protect you, you wear one to protect me. And we do know, we don't have specific science that gives me a number yet, but if we're both wearing those and we need to come within that 6 foot of spacing, we're doing a heck of a job to really lower the risk of us contracting COVID. And that's going to be key to this whole operation. So when I do my outreach with the business community, I am preaching, preaching, preaching. No shirt, no shoes, no mask, no service. To try to encourage people who have health conditions that are going to force them to be unable to wear those masks. It's going to happen in the workplace too. And employers in the workplace are going to need to be prepared to have alternatives to work with that employee through the ADA processes to find alternatives to that work arrangement for that person. We're going to have the same thing in public too, and we can manage that. What we can't manage is 10% of us wearing them and 90% not, because all we're going to do at that point is spike our outbreak. And as the governor has said over and over and over, that Safe Start plan moves in both directions. And as Governor Whitmer has shown, she is not afraid to protect Michigan families. And if we start to see spikes that are not controlled and that we can't control, I have no doubt that the governor will move us back into a stay home, stay safe order. And we know, and we're seeing the numbers come out, you know, the governor's quick action and hard line on this has saved thousands of Michigan lives, as well as prevented infections for tens of thousands of Michiganders. And because, I like to remind everybody, it's the novel coronavirus, which means none of us, no matter how strong we think we are, have immunities developed for this disease. So the better prepared we are to protect our communities and to protect our neighbors by wearing the face covering, maintaining social distancing, following the guidelines that the governor put out, both in the workplace and as a customer, protects that person on the other side of you's livelihood, and it protects you from potentially being infected with COVID. So as you can tell, I've turned into a politician and I can talk for the rest of this hour, but I will pause there because I really want to get into the questions and answers.
Yeah, let me just mention, thank you, Sean, I appreciate that. Let me just mention that all the questions that I'm gonna ask were submitted by you all. So So I'm going to just jump right into it. So one question for the panel is, if testing is required upon my return to work, should employers provide that documentation to the building or to the employees in the building, in the work offices, to everyone regarding who's in, and who has COVID, or who has COVID, whether they need to know?
I can take that one, Gail, and then others can chime in. I think if the question is, if an employee comes and gets tested, are the results of that test shared with the coworkers?
Correct.
Yeah. So the unfortunate reality of where we are is that the OSHA has not put out specific guidelines to deal with many of the issues that we're facing, unlike what you saw with the H1N1 or even with HIV. However, the American with Disabilities Act generally, so we can kind of capture general principles of different laws that would apply and make an argument about what may be the end result. General principles are that under the American with Disabilities Act, an employer that is making an, quote, inquiry into an employee's medical condition has to keep that information confidential and cannot share that information, has to keep it in a separate file. An inquiry is basically when an employer is making a request for medical status, or like an exam, pre-application, post-application, while an employee is employed, or if there's a voluntary medical examination. Those are the three reasons in the statute. So if an employee shares the information voluntarily, then that's not covered under the confidentiality provision. There have been cases under the ADA, and again, we're talking ADA, we're not talking in this unique circumstance, but we're talking HIV, or we're talking other issues that happened before our pandemic. There have been cases suggesting that if an employer shares that information on a need-to-know basis, so for instance, if the employer wants to have an employee investigated for fraud, for not responding appropriately in an employment application, then that employer can share that information with one of the supervisors who participates in the investigation.
Right.
But as far as broadly sharing that, I would suggest no, because of the ADA and its protections. However, then on the flip side of that, you have the OSHA issue, right? Where if I'm working next to Jim and Jim's tested positive and my employer doesn't do anything to alert me of that, then I'm working in an unsafe environment. So what I've seen happen in some employers is they will, once Jim tests positive, they'll go to the other coworkers who've been around Jim within the last 14 days and say, you've been exposed to someone who has COVID and you should take the necessary precautions. So that's, that's sort of what I've seen happen, but right. I would hazard that would not be something that you can just go, hey, Jim right. tested positive every time.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Yeah, I appreciate that. Okay, so let me ask broadly then, what about building safety? Since we're talking about people, let's move to the building. Now, is the employer, should the employer or share information about the building, the way that they've cleaned it, the way that they've, cleaned the premises and their cleaning practices? Are they obligated to share that information with their employees?
So I'd like to try to tackle that one. I've lost our list, Bob and Richard, so I'm not sure if I'm getting out of order, but on some of the things we're going to try to tackle, but I would like to tie on to Richard's comments on sharing that information. So the executive order says that, as everybody's heard, DHHS is going to be doing some contact tracing, and employers are going to be obligated to do that too. So if there is a positive test, like Richard said, an employer should be notifying me if I was, within a short distance of that person, not necessarily telling me that it was Sean, but saying, you know, one of our employees was is confirmed with COVID, you were within that range, and then taking appropriate precautions. And that includes potential subcontractors and others where they may have had connections. That executive order also requires that employee to be out of the workplace. So to that example, if you've tested positive for COVID, you shouldn't be at work. And if you are, that's a MIOSHA violation right out of the gate. So that would be, you know, that's the way we should tackle that quickly. As far as the building piece and how they're cleaning, there's specific training components that every employer is going to have to do for employees returning to work. So if you're back at work and you haven't been trained on anything, that's strike one. You definitely want to check in with MIOSHA and kind of look at what those pieces are and possibly file a complaint. If they have done training, it's supposed to include those pieces, which is how COVID spreads, all that kind of stuff, as well as cleaning and all of those things. So I don't know if necessarily they have to hand you like, hey, this is what we're doing when we're coming in, because in theory, you should have been trained to do that. It's also supposed to include how you file a workplace safety complaint.
Okay, great. All right, so Sean, this one probably is more directed to you. This is, has any agency weighed in on the air filtration system in buildings?
Yes.
I mean, is there a requirement to prevent or to, you know, diminish the COVID?
So we have two things going on, right? We have a public health crisis, and then we have a workplace safety. I wouldn't call it a crisis, but a challenge, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yes, the engineering control guidance from MIOSHA discusses, you know, MERV ratings for air filters. If anybody listening knows what a MERV rating is, you're as much of a dork as I am. HEPA is the top. They don't have to go to a HEPA filter on their system because most can't handle it. You know, they should be considering, but from the science standpoint, we have not gotten a specific X, Y, and Z. So when we come in with like our MIOSHA folks go in, that is going to be a question, because in enclosed public spaces or enclosed office buildings or gyms or whatever, in the gym sector, I believe there is something about increasing the fresh air coming in and less recirculation of the air, which is the norm. If you have AC in your building, it's normally recirculating through, increasing the amount of fresh air to try to tamp down the amount of virus that could be hanging in the air. So, but there's nothing that I can point to for just a general office right now that says you have to do this. That's just one of the many mitigation measures that an employer needs to take into consideration.
Okay, thanks. Let me just ask either Richard or Bob about hazard pay. Is there a requirement that employees get hazard pay, and who gets it?
There is no legal requirement to receive hazard pay. Many employers have provided hazard pay for those that were essential workers. The HEROES Act, which is now pending in Congress, does provide for hazard pay for many of the essential workers. But there is no legal requirement for hazard pay.
Thanks.
But it is something that the unions in many employment settings where it is a unionized environment have successfully been able to negotiate hazard pay.
Okay. Let's see, when you're working at home, can you expect that your employer, and I know this answer, I don't think you can expect an employer to reimburse you, but generally employers have been doing it. So is anyone going to piggyback on that? Bob?
What do you mean reimburse?
Oh, but you're working at home. So
Using
you
your
have
own internet, your
so
own
now
phone.
you have to get internet so that you can have Zoom meetings. You also have to get maybe a laptop, maybe you know, your desktop's at work. Or so someone asked that. I would venture to say that no, the employer has no obligation, but most employers have been reimbursing. I think that's something that you need to negotiate with.
Yeah, there's no legal requirement
Right.
to do so.
Right.
Back prior to the Trump tax cuts, it probably could have been something that you could deduct off of your taxes, but the chances of that becoming above the itemized deduction, the general deduction limits, are unlikely at this point. But yeah, it is something that obviously on a moral basis, they should reimburse you for those expenses. But there's no legal requirement.
Right. Okay. And are there any rules that apply when a company orders a worker to return to work, but maybe changes or modifies their working hours? Let's say they don't need an employee that works 40 hours a week any longer. They now need you just 20 hours a week.
Yeah, if the leave was covered under the Family Medical Leave Act, which if it's a COVID leave, if you're testing positive, you have an argument.
No, let's just say it's a return to work. They're just returning to work from the stay-at-home order. And now that the employer doesn't have the same amount of business as it had in the past. So there's no obligation.
Yeah, I mean, if it's not an FMLA, I mean, there's nothing that I'm aware of that would require the employer to put you exactly in the same place, same shift. FMLA doesn't have a regulation speaking to that issue, but if it's not an FMLA,
yeah, we'll talk about that in a moment.
Yeah, and one thing to add about that, if that's something that an employer is doing, I would encourage them to look into the job share program through the unemployment agency. Therefore, based on the reduced hours, I don't want to, it's a little bit detailed, but you can reduce everybody's hours a bit and still be eligible for unemployment, then everybody would get the $600. So if you did it in a way that everybody took a 1 day off, which is, you know, a 20% reduction in hours for everybody, everybody would still be eligible for unemployment and then still eligible while it lasts for the $600 federal element to that, which is what many of the state workers did, what many of the city of Detroit workers did, what many workers and that's not just the state of Michigan employees or public employees. That program is available to all employees under the work share program.
Right.
Even if your employer doesn't do that, if your wages as you return are less than, Sean,
70%,
$543 or something like that, you're still eligible for unemployment and still eligible for the $600.
and if you wanted to, this doesn't protect your job, but as far as suitable work, being recalled to suitable work, if it's 70% or less than your layoff earnings, it's not considered suitable. So in theory, you would remain eligible for unemployment benefits if you said, I'm not coming back at 20 hours or whatever. But that's not going to protect your position. Just be clear, that's not going to protect your job.
Right.
But you could continue to get unemployment benefits.
And the unemployment, just to piggyback on that, is that the $600 that you're getting from the feds that's due to expire soon. Is that right?
Yeah, end of July.
End of July. Okay. All right. So just shift a little bit now. I'm going to move to PPE. Should employers be provided to? Employers are obligated under OSHA to provide employees with PPE. Is that correct, Sean?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I have someone asked a question, are we required to wear a mask at work when it's really, really hot?
Yeah, I think Richard dealt with that, but the answer is yes. They can require you to wear a mask. The exception to that would be if you have some sort of disability.
That was going to be my next question. So I was going to ask that if you do have some type of underlying health condition, a disability, are you then required to wear a mask?
You still may be. The employer. Oh, go ahead, Richard.
No, I was going to say you want to get a doctor's note if that's the case. The disability test is you ask for a reasonable accommodation, and the employer has to meet it unless there's an undue hardship. The employer would say, if you're not able to work with a mask, we may not have a job for you, at least in this area. Now, the employer should still try to have you telework or try to do whatever it can to keep you working to meet your accommodation for that disability. But certainly you want to try to get a doctor's note to have a doctor verify that there's a problem with you wearing that.
Yeah, and there are some employers that I've experienced that you can't wear a face mask due to a disability reason. They provide you with a face shield.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay,
And so I've seen a lot of that. But
right.
I want to make clear, if you don't want to wear a mask because of some sort of political stance, that's not going to be sufficient.
Right.
And I would just reiterate what I said earlier is that I know it's hot. I think we all agree that these masks are not the most comfortable thing to wear, but they're the tool. They are the tool for us to contain the spread.
Right. All right, I'm gonna shift to exposures. I think you guys have talked about some of that. So if a worker feels that they have been they've been exposed to the virus at work, so are they eligible first for any type of like workers' compensation?
Mhm.
Or
Yes. There's a
they feel that they were exposed. So I know that the bar can be relatively high to try to prove that you actually got it from work and not from some social activity or something. So can you talk about that briefly?
yeah.
About-
Early on, the Whitmer administration put out an order indicating that there's a presumption that if you got COVID and you were working, the presumption was that you contracted it at work. So certainly that assists employees who want to apply for unemployment. But
Okay.
again, you really want to run the numbers, because it may be that depending on what you make, and I think the cutoff is if you make less than $24 an hour on the job, you actually may make more off work applying for unemployment than you would under workers' comp. So you just have to run the numbers and see what
Okay.
makes sense for you.
Sean, you wanted to join in? You had something to add to that?
I just wanted to say how proud I was of, we put that rule forward before the stay home, stay safe order for those high risk employees, and very proud of that rule. And everybody that gets exposed at work can file a claim. The proofs are the challenge. So that presumption was critical for those first response employees to help shore up their potential case.
Right.
Oh,
But
how
Yeah,
difficult
for
is it to
response
show
workers.
those proofs? How difficult is it for people to win workers' comp? Because I know that traditionally workers' comp has not been easy to win.
Richard, you want to take that one?
No, I mean,
We
let
need
me
Andrea, Pam.
Yeah.
the hammer.
The
Yeah,
hammer.
right. We need the hammer, our third leg. No, I mean it. Let me just point out, I'm glad Sean clarified that presumption is for first responders. I wonder, hint, if that'll be expanded to every worker, but we'll see. I know if Sean Egan had anything to do with it, it certainly would. No, I mean, workers' comp, the challenge in any workers' comp case, I mean, I don't practice in it, but I know something about it, is that you have to prove that the injury was contracted at work. And
Right.
if that presumption weren't there for first responders, you'd have to literally put on proofs as to where you were, who you were with, who doesn't, and you basically have to prove the negative, that all the people that you were next to did not have the virus.
Right. Well, I'm glad you brought up the point that sometimes the numbers may work out in your favor if you just go the other, through unemployment. So that's a
And
good
Gail,
point.
I want to add a little something to that.
Yeah. Mhm.
The exposure itself will not provide you benefits under workers' comp. You would have to actually get it. You would actually have to be injured or sick.
Good point. No, good point.
So there is no remedy under workers' comp for the exposure, which is no different than being exposed to asbestos or a toxic chemical or a carcinogen. You don't actually contract the illness, there's no benefits. However, under, at least in Michigan, the executive order for quarantine, if it is close contact with somebody who tested positive
Mm-hmm.
for COVID, you're required to quarantine yourself for 14 days. that 14-day quarantine period is then covered under the Families First Paid Leave Act if you work for an employer under 500. So, which provides for 100% of pay in that scenario, plus a continuation of health care. So that's why these things get a little bit complicated, because there's different options and a different way to do it, depending on the precise scenario that you're dealing with.
Okay. All right. I don't mean to cut you off, but we have a ton of questions. I just want to get as many of the participants' questions in as possible. So you answered the next question, really. So if a worker has not been diagnosed with COVID but feels that they may have it, then that you pretty much have responded to that question. So let's talk about workplace or worker privacy. I think, Sean, you addressed this earlier, but someone asked about HIPAA specifically. I know HIPAA is for a healthcare provider. It's not necessarily related to the employer. So the question was, can an employer ask personal questions or privacy questions like where you have traveled? Because I know that some employers have a question on their return to work that says, have you been to, any of these states, or have you been on a cruise, or these things? So can an employer ask about your private behavior, your out of work behavior? Oh, whoever asked that question.
Yes.
Yeah, there was actually some EEOC. Who was it? There was some EEOC.
Lawyers are quiet.
Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm.
EEOC put out some guidelines indicating that a lot of those questions are permissible. You can ask questions based on, it's sort of like the making sure that you're able to perform the essential functions of your job, you're fit for duty when you do return, making sure that you're not bringing the virus into the workplace. So a lot of those things are permissible.
Now I remember reading something recently, and I could be wrong, but if I recall, is that only if they show up on like the CDC website as these areas that are high COVID areas. And I think like China, I don't know who's listed on it now, but I think cruise ships. So you may have to report a cruise ship, but if you went to Ohio, you may not have to report it.
But think of it, so a lot of the health screenings, including there's a My Symptoms app that DHHS built, and it's just going to ask you if you've traveled anywhere where COVID is, prevalent.
Mm-hmm.
And think of it from the other perspective is that if MIOSHA shows up because you had an outbreak, they're going to ask you who's been in here. And if an employer didn't ask you those questions and you brought COVID back into the workplace, they're going to have violated their responsibility potentially to everybody that works in there because of that. So I think Richard's right on the money. I mean, if they're asking you where you traveled, that's fair game. I don't think there's any way for you to say, you can't ask me that question, but.
Okay.
Your travel information is not confidential in any manner.
Let me say this. Travel information, what if you don't have COVID? It is just a screening question to get you back to work. So it's not that you have symptoms. It's not a tracking, like they're trying to track or trace your connections. It's simply that you're returning to work.
So how do you know you have? I mean,
right.
That's the questions are being asked to see if you run the risk of having been somewhere where you could have been exposed.
Yeah. Now, I understand the frustration because it's silly to ask somebody whether they've been to Toledo. That works in Detroit.
Right.
And especially at the time when Detroit had a major outbreak and Toledo didn't. Toledo should be asking whether you came from Detroit.
Right.
And it is kind of silly, but it's just that your travel information is not confidential in any way. It's not, they're not asking you for your social security number. They're not asking you for medical information. They're not asking you for any of that stuff that's confidential. Medical information that they're asking you, like symptomology, do you have a fever? Do you have a cough? Do you have shortness of breath?
Right.
That is medical information that raises issues not under HIPAA, but under the ADA as to medical inquiries. but because of the business necessity during the pandemic, the EEOC has put out guidance that said you can ask those questions.
And keep in mind that the science is all over the place, but perhaps 35% or higher are folks that are going to carry this thing and never ever have a symptom and can transmit it. So, as silly as those questions seem, there is a purpose.
Okay. So is an employer, I'm changing topics just briefly, is an employer responsible to compensate you in any way if they ask you to leave work to self-quarantine?
So, first of all, under some situations, the quarantine is not optional.
Right.
The quarantine is pursuant to a government order that
Right.
you must quarantine yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So if you come in, if you test positive, if you have symptoms of COVID, if you come in close contact with somebody that has COVID,
Right.
you are to quarantine yourself. So it has nothing to do with your employer. So if your employer said, hey, we want you to continue and come on in, they can't, because also the quarantine order specifically states that you can't be retaliated against in any way in an employment setting because you are adhering to the quarantine order.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is it paid is a much more difficult conversation because, again, it brings up this mishmash of different things between Families First Leave Act, unemployment, company sick leave policy. In most circumstances, you're going to be compensated in some way. It's just in what way you're going to be compensated. So, for example, if you're quarantined under most circumstances, even if you have no paid sick leave and you got to be at home for 2 weeks, you're going to be eligible for unemployment.
Okay.
And right now, that isn't so bad for most workers because of the $600 additional federal benefit. But that will become more of an issue if they don't pass the law that was passed in Congress to extend those unemployment benefits.
Okay.
But in addition, just to add, the one problem, the one loophole, an unfortunate thing about the Families First Act is that paid sick leave and the additional 10 weeks of FMLA does not apply for healthcare employers who decide to opt out. So, it could be that if I'm a healthcare worker, if I'm the nurse or nurse assistant, and I, work for a company of less than 500 employees, I still don't get the paid leave. I have to resort to either unemployment, workers' comp, or whatever else is available.
Or their sick
And
bank.
in that circumstance, the quarantine order may not apply to you either.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
All right. Talking about quarantine, let's see. Should a worker that just feels sick during these times, but has no temperature, for example, be made to come to work or go home? I mean, who makes that? I mean, can an employer send you home if you just say I'm sick? Or do you have to have some type of test or positive test results? Or
You just have to be.
because I know those symptoms have been changing over the last couple of months on the CDC website.
Yeah, I think all of us can probably chime in pretty well, but no, it's symptoms, any of the symptoms of COVID, which are varied. So, for some people, it is a fever. For some, it's just going to be a cough. For some, it's going to be body aches, like peculiar body aches. For some, it's going to be stomach issues. So to defer to this could be COVID is the right thing to do right now. Until we actually know exactly, it's X, Y, and Z. Because right now, those symptoms have been changing, but there's some consistency in fever, cough, stomach, and some of those other pieces. So if it's in those categories, I think you're good.
Okay. What if you had let's say you're just anxious, you're stressed out because you've now been asked to return to work. You don't feel comfortable going back to work. You feel unsafe. So now you have psychological possibly issues. So can you refuse to go to work, and how long can you refuse to go to work if it's not COVID related, but now it's stress or, more mental related.
Yeah, I think that you would only be able to rely on traditional FMLA, which is if you have a serious medical condition in which you cannot work, you would be eligible for up to 12 weeks of leave unpaid.
Okay.
I mean, you could also try, stress is an compensable injury under workers' comp. I mean, it's tough to prove, but that's another option. I suppose you want to apply for that.
You haven't been to work. You're being asked to go back to work. So how does that tie into workers' comp?
Oh, so you are at home and
Yeah, your employers, because now these stay-at-home orders
so
are lifted. Okay,
yeah.
gotcha. All right, now should the company have some type of procedure for paying employees if they're sent home? I think that's more contractual. I think we would agree that's more of a contractual, or that's based on your employer. If they send you home, do they have to pay you? That's the question.
It depends on what you're sent home for. I mean, you would have a right to be paid under the Families First Act, depending on what you're sent home for. If you're sent home because you have symptomology, you have a right to be paid. So we do have employers, and I have seen a lot, particularly in the construction industry, who are not accustomed to paying their employees paid time off, that have no idea that they're supposed to be paying that employee whose temperature was high and they sent home. And they have no idea that they're supposed to be home for 2 weeks. So, it does take the unions and the employees to have some education, to work with these employers, especially the smaller employers that are less sophisticated, to get them to know what the employees' rights are. The employees absolutely have a right to paid leave,
and
even
that's
in situations where they typically would not have.
And that's for 2 weeks? Because I know that some of these COVID people have been test positive. They may test positive for much longer than 2 weeks.
Yes, the
But the pay issue is only for the 2 weeks. Is that
for the
right?
2 weeks, right?
All
But
right.
to
But then you
clarify
may be
that,
able to go on unemployment.
yeah,
Oh,
you did have one person note in the earlier discussion in the chat room too, that there is a proration for part-time folks. So it's an equivalent proration, just.
Yeah.
okay. So even if you're part-time, you still will get paid, but it'll be prorated based on the hours that you.
Yeah.
Yeah, you typically work 2 days a week or 16 hours a week, then you're
Right.
going to get 32 hours of pay.
All right. So let me just move to unemployment, all the leave questions. Some of them may have already been answered, but let me just go over. So if you're unemployed, do you still have, well, no, that's not. Okay. On what grounds can an employee be terminated? I think I've asked that question, for not returning to work. How long can an employee be out, paid or not paid, before the termination is imminent if it's COVID related? How long can they be out?
Well, if it's COVID related and they're adhering to the quarantine order, then they're absolutely protected.
Yeah.
Right.
They cannot suffer an adverse employment action because they're doing it. But if, let's say they had, let's use the close contact rule. They came in close contact at work with somebody who had tested positive for COVID. They stayed home for 2 weeks, which is how long they're supposed to quarantine. And then beyond that 2 weeks, they don't want to come back anymore. Well, it's not protected beyond the 2 weeks.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
it is protected for the 2 weeks that you're supposed to be home.
So what if someone, because I mean, you hear horror stories about some people who've been testing positive for 30 days or 45 days. I think that was the most. So can someone be out and still have job protection by testing positive for 30, 40 days?
Yeah, well, I mean, you would still have FMLA. In that situation where somebody has that condition where they're incapacitated for longer than 3 days, they're going to be protected under FMLA for up to 12 weeks. But of course, that doesn't cover really small employers with less than 50 employees within a 75-mile radius. and that's unpaid. And the employee may have used FMLA prior to the pandemic and didn't have very much time left. But FMLA is the protection. That we have decided the public policy in this country is to protect 12 weeks of leave and not 12 weeks in one day.
Wow. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
potentially under Executive Order 36, which expanded Michigan's Paid Medical Leave Act to all employers, whether paid or unpaid, without a reference to a time limit. It gives some parameters, so it's possible that that would carry on.
Very good. That's really good news to hear. All right. So, excuse me. All right. What is the employer's obligation of managing and reporting to the union? So this is more of a union question. Do they have any obligation to report to the union regarding when they begin eliminating positions due to having their business, not as much business? So now they want to eliminate positions, furlough or layoff. I know this answer, but I'll let one of you answer this.
The traditional rule under the labor law, state and federal, is that if a union asks information about the terms and conditions of employment for its membership, police and the union contract, for instance, is that the employer would have to provide that information. What's interesting about the world we're in today is that every COVID-related question, particularly those dealing with changes in employment conditions on the private sector side, every COVID-related question has been, all the regions across the country have been told to send that basically to Donald Trump's appointee, Peter Robb. And without getting into too much of it, basically the way that it works is the general counsel is appointed as like the prosecutor for all of the NLRB unfair labor practice charges across the nation. And he has the opportunity to write what's called an advice memorandum, where he gives his opinion, his legal opinion on what needs to happen with particular labor laws. And he's asked all issues to be sent to him so that he can issue rulings on them. And so the real concern is that there's going to be something coming down the pipe which is not favorable to unions. He's already issued a memorandum a few months ago, kind of laying out when an employer can make changes without having bargained with the unions. But the rule right now is that if you make a request related to an employment condition, the employer has to respond. And I'll just say elections have consequences.
Right. We got to keep our eyes open. Thank you for letting us know that, Richard. Wow.
I would quickly tag on there, Gail, that under the Michigan WorkShare program, which Bob mentioned, which I encourage everybody to take a look at, unionized workplaces too, it requires that the union agrees to the program they submit. So if your employer is moving that to WorkShare, UIA will require a union agreement.
Good news. Okay, great. All right, so moving to childcare. If you have to take care of your kids, you can't go back to work. I mean, what happens? I mean, your kids are young, their school's closed or their daycare is closed. You can't go back to work. Now your employer is asking you to return. What happens?
So again, the Families First leave extends FMLA for the child care portion of it for 12 weeks at 2/3 pay, up to $200 a day. As I said in the beginning, child care provider, I think, is going to be and should be interpreted broadly. So while everybody was in school, obviously everybody was impacted when their children were home from school. Now it's the summer, so I anticipate we're going to have some employers saying, well, your kid's not, the school closure doesn't affect your child anymore because the school's out for the summer. But still, some parents may be affected by the fact that whatever child care arrangements they typically have in the summer are not open, which could include grandma. That grandma is not the appropriate person to be watching a bunch of children right now.
Right.
And that's not available, that you would be eligible for the 12 weeks of 2/3 pay up to $200 a week. And that money is reimbursed by the federal government. So that's not really your employer paying that money. That's really the federal government paying that.
Ah, okay.
And we did put into, I mentioned earlier in the UIA suitable work policy, a reasonable belief that your workplace is unsafe. You could continue to collect unemployment. Again, this doesn't protect your job, but we also included childcare problems. That you can continue to be eligible for unemployment benefits in Michigan. And again, that doesn't protect your job status, but it means you're still eligible.
That's a current regulation?
Yes,
That's-
Yeah, it's a
Oh, okay.
policy. Yep.
that's in Executive Order 76, I believe, right, Sean?
Ah,
Yeah, and then an internal policy that expanded out some of the definitions.
so that's an issue that in Michigan, you're still protected, but in other states need to check their.
Yeah,
Well, let's not necessarily say protected. Let's say you're still going to qualify for unemployment benefits.
Okay, very good. You're not job protected. You're eligible for unemployment. I got you. Thank you.
Beyond just the FFCRA that Bob's mentioned. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Now, can an employer force you to use your personal time? Say you're fearful of coming back to work, or you're taking care of your kids, or whatever. Can an employer force you to use personal banked time, like personal days?
Yeah, so one important element, there's some small issues in Families First that you should look into in particular circumstances. But one of the things that's good in Families First, in addition to a lot of other things, is that that is used first. So if you're eligible for the 2 weeks of leave, or for the 10 weeks of leave, or the 2 weeks plus the 10 additional weeks because of childcare issues, that is used first. But if you don't qualify for Families First and you're out for some other reason, an employer theoretically could force you to use your banked sick time. But then again, there's unemployment, there's other issues that may get involved in there.
Right.
And on that question, Gail, a lot of what I've been seeing in the healthcare industry is that employees who would not be able to get the Family First Act benefits, but may want to go on unemployment because of the additional $600, are being told by the employers, you're going to be draining your paid leave. And of course, because under unemployment or executive order, you don't get unemployment if you are receiving paid leave. They're stuck burning their own time without the additional $600.
I always encourage everybody to take a look at hopefully their union contract,
Right.
but if not, their employment policy to potentially request an unpaid leave while unemployment is still adding the $600 as a potential option. But to that point,
Because I was surprised to hear when Richard was explaining this to me earlier that our essential workers who work in healthcare don't have a lot of the same benefits that everyone else has. Can you just mention that, Richard, again?
Yeah, well, they don't have what Bob talked about, the 2 weeks of paid leave, 100%. They don't have, or 2/3. They don't have the additional 10 weeks of FMLA extension due to childcare issues. It's unfair. Literally, if I'm a truck driver and I work for a company with less than 500 people, or I'm a grocery store clerk, and I get the COVID, I get 2 weeks paid that I don't have to drain my own time. But if I'm a healthcare worker, I do have to drain my own time. And I do encourage healthcare unions that you can demand negotiation over that issue, that if I'm going to be excluded from the FFCRA, I will at least demand to bargain over the fact that you not allow me to burn my time. That's a bargainable issue.
Thank you, Richard. And then I'm almost at the end. So let me just mention, because I thought this was a great question. It's really about collective bargaining. So they asked, what's the most relevant, MIOSHA regs that should be brought to the table when I'm negotiating a safe workplace, since COVID? What do people negotiate now, or unions? What can they put out there on the table?
Hazard pay. Hazard pay. The issue that I just mentioned. The interesting way that the statute is, the FFCRA is written, is it suggests that an employer can make the decision, a healthcare employer can make the decision to opt out of having that benefit apply to its workers. So, I've said, hey, throw some caution to the wind and try to negotiate that. But basically, all of the issues that pertain to having to be off work because of this virus.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously negotiating the safety protocols regarding the return to operations when that was happening, and if that hasn't been done, it's still a good thing to do, to negotiate those safety protocols with the union. And I've seen a lot of good cooperation, which I don't say very often, between employers and unions in terms of developing those safety protocols. And I think that has created a lot of union environments that are safer by orders of magnitude than a lot of non-union settings.
Right.
And,
Okay.
But OSHA itself has not put out a lot of binding
Right.
guidance, but they've just put out guidance material,
Guidance,
kind of
right.
as suggestions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Sean might have some input on that as well.
Yeah, and I would suggest that certainly, as we all know, those pieces I mentioned that MIOSHA put together that we believe are enforceable using the general duty clause and others, recognize that they're tied to sort of the CDC. So if we get a vaccine or something, who knows if that'll be this year, next year, 5 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
Recognize that at some point, CDC is going to start changing that stuff. So I understand your employer at least has to do that, but I would go grab those and start building pieces onto it if you can within the workplace, or cementing those into your labor agreements so that as conditions change, we've been told with climate change that these things will become more frequent. And if they do, we want to be prepared for them better than we were for this one.
No, great ideas. All right. So the final question I have is that employers been granted some of the CARES Act funds. Does the union have access to knowing what that employer received?
Yeah, so I assume what they mean is the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program.
Oh, right.
They may also be eligible for other. There's three main elements that are helping out small businesses. There's also CARES Act, larger stuff for the airplane industry. There's a lot of different elements to it, but most of the money that's out there is PPP money.
PPP is the payroll money, right? Is that what
Paycheck Protection Program?
Yeah, that's what. Okay.
And that is essentially a loan from the Small Business Administration that can be used for payroll and mortgage,
Mm-hmm.
Utilities, and can be a forgiven loan. The Department of Treasury has waffled on whether that information will be made public.
Right.
Initially, they said no. Then there are some high-profile businesses that got money that didn't need money. So then they said, well, if it's over a certain size, it'll be made public. And now they've said none of it'll be public, but they're taking a substantial amount of heat. Obviously, that's taxpayer money. Taxpayers should have a right to know where that money goes.
Right.
So that it may waffle back yet again, or there might be additional congressional action that'll require disclosure. But then the issue is, can you request the information from your employer? And that gets a little more tricky into their financial information. Obviously, if that issue is raised at the table, if they said that we got PPP money,
Mm-hmm.
you might be able to make a request for information to verify that, to ask for the information backing it up, which would include the data, but you may not be automatically entitled to request it.
Mm.
I mean, a lot of the traditional labor laws apply. I mean, there's been suggestions that the unions would not be eligible to that. But like, for instance, if you're at the table and they plead poverty, then that opens the door for the union to ask for that. Or if you could link it somehow to your ability to represent your members, then maybe you can make the request. A lot of that's not been written yet because there's not been any case law that's been
Yeah.
ruled on by
I mean,
the court.
wasn't part of the purpose that you pay for payroll for the employees? So would that get you in?
I mean, I
Let's
say, think it, yeah, but worth a shot. Do it. Throw some people in.
You can ask, yeah.
Yeah.
Hey,
All they can do is say no, and you can follow you up.
Right.
Then we'll figure it out.
All right. So let me-
And Gail, if you don't mind, there was a question in the comment I wanted to answer really quick. And
I was just going to have Jackie mention
okay.
some of the comments. So, no, but you can go ahead. Go ahead. You start with that one.
There was a question about the extension of FMLA for the childcare issues and whether it has to be used in consecutive weeks, and it doesn't. Same thing with traditional FMLA, because it's just an extension of FMLA. It can be used intermittently, it can be used on a reduced schedule, and it can be used for an extended period of time. So
Right.
if for example, due to your spouse's work schedule or work from home schedule or whatever, that you only need Monday and Tuesday to stay home to care for the kids, you can just do Monday and Tuesday. Or if you only need it for certain weeks or certain times of the year, you can do it that way.
Okay.
Another, and forgive me if this is, but I think this is an important issue. And that is there's a push and pull as to disclosure of information regarding positive COVID tests. And I've experienced it many times through questions with different workers and different unions, which is the individual does not want their medical information, their positive COVID test, disclosed to their coworkers. The coworkers want to know
Right.
who they've come in contact with that has tested positive with COVID.
Right.
And it makes it very difficult because there are countervailing laws and interests that protect a little bit on both sides. That under the ADA, it may be that disclosing the individual who tested positive is not appropriate. Now, disclosing that somebody tested positive is not a problem. And then on the other side, under more OSHA regulations of being able to report hazards, there may be a requirement to notify the coworkers as a reportable event of people who test positive for COVID. Now, in a practical sense, it creates a very difficult environment in the workplace because there's somebody who just stopped working for the last week. And the employer is going around and saying, hey, somebody tested positive,
Right.
and everybody knows who it is.
Right. Right.
And then you have an obligation under the law to quarantine yourself if you came in close contact. How can you, as a worker, know whether you came in close contact with the person if nobody is confirming with you who had it, or that person who I work next to tested positive?
Right.
You won't tell me. So it puts a difficult environment for unions, difficult environment for employers, a difficult environment for coworkers. Because of course, you're also going to call that coworker who hasn't been to work for a week and say, hey, did you test positive?
Right.
And maybe that person doesn't want somebody to know. So they either have to say, they're not going to say, I'm not going to tell you. They're either going to lie and say no.
They're going to say, did the employer tell you it was me? That's what they're going to say. Yeah.
So it's a really difficult, tricky scenario. I think that most unions are, bear on the side of safety to get the notification out there, ask the member if it's okay. If they disclose it, many are okay with it, and get that information out there so people can take the appropriate course of action. Because what the employers may do is not, if you leave it up to the employer to determine who came in close contact, it'll be probably nobody.
Right. Okay. Yeah, we got 5 minutes left. Jackie, are there any other questions in the chat?
I think a lot of the questions were answered. There is one question that I kind of merged in from several comments, though, in terms of employees that have returned to work and their shifts have changed, their hours have changed, their job duties have changed. What are the rights and responsibilities in terms of that?
Yeah, if it's, as we said, if it's an FMLA issue, I think the regulation is 29 USC 825.215, which says that generally, and again, generally, you should be returned to your same shift and location if you have qualified for an FMLA serious health condition. If it's not, there's nothing in the law which requires that when you return, you be put back. You know, I mean, again, that's a bargainable issue, though. That's something which.
But if you were, Richard, you bring up a point. So if you were out on a 2-week quarantine for COVID, so is that's automatically an FMLA, because that would automatically be considered a serious health condition? Is that?
I'd certainly argue that, absolutely.
I mean, I know that's what
You
I would
may
argue.
argue it, but you may not argue it successfully if
Yeah.
you don't otherwise
That's
fit
the
the
question.
criteria for FMLA.
Right.
So, for example, you know, in some situations, COVID, especially for younger people, is not very serious,
Right.
and it is, you know, been described as little more than a cold. That's not going to qualify you for FMLA necessarily. However, there are other arguments that crafty lawyers like Richard and myself are prepared to make in that situation.
Right, and your healthcare
And
provider,
we'll test
right?
it if that's necessary.
Yeah,
I mean-
so I don't know that, whether healthcare providers automatically see that you test positive for COVID, whether they consider that automatically a serious health condition, or
Yeah.
whether they.
I don't think, no, it's definitely not automatic. I mean, you've
But
got
it would
to
be,
3 criteria of FMLA.
You have to have some.
yeah, it would be interesting to see. So, for example, for one of the elements is whether you're incapacitated for 3 days.
More
That's-
than 3.
More than 3 days.
Mhm.
So does a quarantine order that puts you at home for 14 days, is that being incapacitated?
Right, that's my point.
Yep.
Yeah. That's a good argument.
I don't know. I
I
say yes, but
Because you can't leave the house. Again, these are all things that are untested. This COVID is, like Sean said earlier, it's a corona
Novel.
virus. Now, thank you. Drawing a blank. It's new. It's novel. It's something that's not been tested. So that would be one we would argue.
But if it's an otherwise unprotected leave, you've just been off because they were closed and they're recalling you to work and all of this stuff has changed. If you don't have a union contract that you're bargaining these issues, it is what it is, right, Bob and Rick?
Right.
Yep.
All right, Jackie, any more questions? Do one more, we can take one more.
How about one more? I think that this is an important one here with health and safety. In terms of masks, I mean, we see all kinds of different masks. And there are several questions in terms of what if I have a pre-existing condition and I need a special type of mask? Maybe does the employer have to provide a particular type of mask? And what if I need something better or different because I have a pre-existing condition? Do they have to provide it?
Probably ADA, huh?
I think under the ADA, if you have a pre-existing condition, as long as it meets the definition of a disability, which is pretty easy nowadays after the amendments,
Yep.
that asking for a reasonable accommodation, as long as you're not asking for a mask that must be gold-plated, it's hard to imagine a mask that's going to provide an undue hardship to the employer to provide.
Right.
If we're talking about a $10 mask rather than a $1 mask, that's still pretty hard to argue that that's an undue hardship.
I saw one of our participants, Kim Kurtz, with her mask on. All right, so we have concluded. Thank you all thank you, Sean, thank you, Bob, thank you, Richard. I very much appreciate you guys going over all those questions. So thank you all participants for joining us. We're going to try to continue having some webinars, a couple more during the summer, to keep you all connected to Wayne State University. Thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate all of you. We'll talk to you soon.
Great. Take
Bye,
care.
everybody.
Thank
Stay
you.
safe.
Thanks, Gail.
Thank you.
Thank you.